enjoy the presentation because we're here live and it's all going to be good. The recording will be what it's going to be. So you remember several months back, we had a visit from Minnie Merton, one of our Brentwood Modern Times denizens, and we learned a lot about what it was like to live in modern times at that point in history. And today we have a very special guest, another denizen of modern times, and although she was here for a very short time, she made an impact and she was quite noted. So I would like to now introduce and welcome Mary Gove Nichols.
Thank you so much for your warm reception. You'll have to excuse me if I seem a little distracted. It's been a very big day for me to come back to this area after so many years and not recognize it at all. So many changes, including a library on this spot that I knew so well. I have to explain that one of the reasons that a library is a great distraction to me is that I loved to read. I loved books. And as much as I loved to study medical theory and practices, I also had a great passion for novels. I would write a few myself, but I got a little distracted out there among some of the shelves. So I'm sorry if I held things up just a little bit. Yet my name is Mary Nichols, by the way. And I have to also say, just looking at the members of the audience today, I'm quite taken with the very intelligent choices of dress all the women have made in attending here today on such a hot day. I was a great proponent of dress reform and taking off the corsets. Dress reform was something that was frowned upon by many, but you have to take into consideration the times, the 1800s, what women were wearing and trying to accomplish while wearing those tight corsets and long skirts. Many was the tale in families' histories of a mother or grandmother or daughter who had gone out in a carriage only to come back in a hearse because her skirts had got tangled in the carriage wheels or trampled by the horse. Not to mention the unhygienic practice of dragging skirts and hoop skirts through the gutters all day long in streets that were never paved and well traveled by dogs and horses and mules and pigs and rats. All of those germs would be dragged into households, both the simple households and the homes of the wealthy women. And let's talk about the open fires in the kitchens, wearing all those large skirts and trying to cook a meal on an open fire. Many of those women were taking their lives in their hands. The restrictions on the human lungs of a single corset. No wonder women were always fainting all the time, passing out at the least provocation. Not to mention women who were with child, constraining all that air, keeping it both from themselves and from the unborn child in their wombs. This would be the result in the end of many pregnancies. All for vanity, all for following traditions that had mostly been set up by men and in practice for so long that to even ask your mother if you could go without a corset or be comfortable like your brothers were, she would tell you no, that it just wasn't proper. Oh, but I'm getting a little ahead of my story. I was asked to come here today and tell you a little bit about my personal life and the time I spent at Modern Times, Brentwood, and my life a little bit beyond that. As a lover of novels, I like to quote Jane Austen, whom I love to read. And she said, "Those who dare to tell their own stories must be listened to in caution." But I will do my best to remember the facts and tell them the way that I remember them in my story. When someone lives in Paris, when someone, I don't know, they have some electromagnetic healing wires on me today. I'm not sure what all this is about. Let me know if you can't hear me. When someone lives as long as I have, one feels that one has lived many lives and does not always get the information correct, but I will share with you my memories and my impression of my life. I was born in Goffstown, New Hampshire in the year 1810. Now, 1810 was a rather significant year Chopin and Schumann were both born in that year. Harriet Beecher Stowe was born in that year. James Madison was the president, and 2 years later, we would have the War of 1812. And over the next decade, several other very famous people would be born. Charles Darwin, Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who played such a big role in the women's movement. All these auspicious people. It was also the same year that a man by the name of James Marshall was born. About 38 years later, he would build a mill out in the state of California, a mill that belonged to a man by the name of John Sutter. And it was James Marshall who would find the first gold nuggets in that mill. Mine was not such an auspicious birth, mother. She had been the oldest of 17 children. So one more born to her was not that big of an event. She was married to my father, William Neal. Her name was Rebecca. She was his second wife. His first wife had passed away, leaving him with 3 children to take care of, which often proved to be the reason why a man would get a second wife, to have someone to take care of those children and ultimately to take care of him. But there was some love in my parents' relationship, which was not always the case at that time. However, they were 2 very extremely different people. They would have 3 of their own children together. I had an older brother who would pass away when he was 20, and a younger sibling as well. But I had 3 older half-siblings by the time I was born. Now, my father considered himself a free thinker. But if you had asked anyone else in Goffstown who my father was, they would have called him the town infidel. He was very outspoken and opinionated and like nothing more than a good argument. In fact, the whole time we were growing up, he would make sure that we could address all issues of faith and then present these preposterous ideas to us, challenging us to defend our faith or defend our beliefs. And he didn't believe in any of them, not the faith or the ideas opposing them. He just wanted to make sure that I could think for myself. My father was one of my best friends. My mother was not. She was a little bit of a free thinker in her own right, but she had joined the Universalist Church. And this presented an idea that was so different from the Methodists and the Calvinists of the time, who felt that everyone was born into this world with a rather predisposed eventuality, this whole idea of predestination. The times were changing, and there was a movement in this country called the Second Great Awakening, led by a man by the name of Lyman Beecher, a great preacher whose son would become Henry Beecher, one of his less intelligent sons, if I might share my personal opinion. But they would have a great influence on spirituality in this country. And people in the church, the ministers in the church, were realizing that there were thousands and thousands of women who were losing their children in childbirth and in those first 3 or 4 years. There was a 50% infant mortality rate in the early 1800s and going well into the 1850s and 1860s. These women who lost their children managed, because of the practices and the ignorance in the practice of childbirth, had no consolation and believed that their children would be for eternity burning in the pit of hell. And people were not always coming to church, and they needed a reinvigoration of the various parishes. So they said, we need to make our laws a little more gentle, the requirements a little more gentle. We need to be preaching a more positive gospel. Isn't it possible that perhaps an individual does not need to have a minister or a church service in order to have a relationship with their Creator? What if each person could have their own relationship with their Creator? And this idea appealed to people, and it was the great revivalist movement. And every year, when it was the summer months, the ministers would come to the various towns, and it was mostly the women who would drag their husbands to these revival meetings to get a little bit of hope, to think that maybe if they lived a good Christian life, they could affect their eternal outcome and have hopes of being in heaven. Remember, it would be in 1848 that out there in California again, gold would be discovered, and people would come not just from all over the United States, but from Europe and Wales and Italy and Japan and China to come and make their fortunes overnight on this gold. That no longer, if you were born into poverty, did you have to remain into poverty. That the only wealthy people had to be born into wealth or royalty. People were starting to be more hopeful and to think they had more control over their destination. So my mother's idea of the Universalist Church accepted a God whose loving plan it was for every human creature to go to heaven. It was an easy idea, an appealing idea, a comforting idea for her. When I was 12 years old, my half-sister Emma would pass away from tuberculosis. My father wept for probably the only time I ever saw him weep. And I came to believe that it was not because just his loss for his daughter, but because he did not really have any real spiritual life of his own or a God for solace, that he had nowhere to turn for comfort. My mother's heart was broken as well, but she had prayer. She had a life of spirit. She would be devastated for a long time, and I came to realize that she loved that daughter much more than she loved me. I was never the outstanding daughter. My sisters were pretty. I was not. My sisters loved everything my mother was teaching them, how to cook a good loaf of brown bread, how to help out around the house, how to dress as a young woman should, which basically came down to dressing to attract a man who could bring some money into the family and take the daughter away and support her so that the father didn't have to. I had no interest in any of those things. I just loved to read. My father had some books and encouraged me to read, but for some odd reason, he would not allow me to write. He felt that writing for a woman was far too much stimulation and no one would ever read it anywhere. But I had found books to be a great joy. I was reading James Fenimore Cooper. I was reading Herman Melville, who would become a friend of mine later in life. I had no idea of that at the time. Poetry and Shakespeare. My mother was very suspicious of these novels, which were, in fact, novel at the time. They were just starting. So she would take those away from me, try to get me to learn how to do a recipe a little more correctly. My father would come into some hard times, aside from losing Emma, but that would be another reason why leaving that house that held so much sadness for both my parents inspired him to move us. We moved to a different area right outside of Goffstown, a place where they were known for making hats and shoes. They would produce about 1.5 million pairs of shoes. 1,500 of the employees were men, 1,500 of the employees were women. It was the main source of income in that town. My father saw to it that I got to attend school, and I finally got to pick up a pencil and paper and began to write. And I loved it. I loved writing. And by that time, my one brother, my half brother, had been attending medical school. And one time when he was home from school, I picked up one of his medical texts and I started reading about the human anatomy, about the lungs, about the skeleton, about the heart, about the brain. It was fascinating. It opened up a whole new world to me. My mother, who had always tried to make me conform, who broke down any sense of individuality that I was drawn to follow my own interests, had suppressed so much. And now I thought, if a person understands their physical self and has that kind of autonomy, what are the limitless possibilities of what they can do as a human being, as a spiritual person, as a helpful member of a community? I would never put first and foremost the whole women's rights movement that would be taking off all while I was growing up. Again, 1848 was the year that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott would sit down together at Mary Ann McClintock's little table in upstate New York and write out those sentiments of independence that they did, the Declaration of Sentiments, asking for all the rights that would correct all the wrongs that were being done to women, including the right to vote. Lucretia Mott even told Elizabeth Cady Stanton the night before, she said, "Elizabeth, thou shalt make fools of all of us if you ask for the right to vote." But Elizabeth was determined. She knew the only way that laws would change was if women had a vote, if they had a voice in the choices that were made for the country. And so she did make bold that day to stand up in front of the small group of people in that little Wesleyan church and ask for the right to vote. Many of the 100 that attended that day and the more than 100 that attended the second day, only women were allowed the first day. Men were allowed to attend the second day. They signed on to all of the requests for women's right to education, women's right in career, divorce rights, property rights. They wouldn't sign on to that one about women having a voice in politics. They had been taught that women's brains could not function that way. Certainly not a majority of the thinkers were going to vote for that. But on that second day, a young man who was a freed slave and wrote for the Northern Star stood up in the back row and eloquently shared his opinion that he did not want to be part of a country where only half of the citizens had a voice in its future. That man was Frederick Douglass, and after he spoke, the majority of the people signed on to all those sentiments. Things were going to change for women. I would learn about what was going on, but my life was about to change in some rather major ways that would cause some distraction from my being more involved in national movements and politics. This was also a time when most of the women who would be moving into the women's rights movement had been working for years as abolitionists, fighting against slavery, doing for others what they came to realize after a short amount of time was a way of living in which they could all relate. Because women at that time had no rights. When a woman got married, that woman became the property of her husband. William Blackwell, I get a headache every time I try to read his commentaries on women's rights. Even though he was a British jurist, somehow his ideas all came to America. That when a man and woman get married, the two become one, and that one is the man. St. Paul started it all with his gospel about man being the head of the woman. But this had been taken to an extreme, and it was written in the law books in the colonies, in the states, in the townships, and it was taken with all the people who were moving out west over the next several decades. There were state law books that talked about the appropriate objects with which a man could hit his wife. I believe some of those laws are still written down today in some states. But our family was not doing well money-wise. And I decided that I needed to make a little money. My mother had somehow managed to teach me a little bit of needlework and sewing, and I was able to make a little money doing that. But I was also getting very interested in writing articles about women's health. And I submitted some of these articles to some of the local newspapers, even sent one to Boston. Not only did they accept my article, they decided to publish it and pay me for it. So I was helping to make a little money. I was thrilled to be getting the money, to be getting to help my mother and my father. But I was also getting more and more interested in the idea of women understanding how their bodies worked and not being subjugated to a male understanding of how a woman's body ought to work and what she ought to feel. Now, I need to step aside from this very preachy lecture, as I can see at this time, because we do have some lovely gentlemen in the audience with us today. I have always believed in the equality of the sexes, And it was never my intention to vilify the male species. We have had many good men over the years who have been loving husbands and active supporters of the women's rights movement. But the professionals and the doctors who could be so dismissive in their treatment of women, telling them that the pains they were feeling were imagined and didn't have the same physiology or makeup to understand how a woman's mind and body worked. I thought women should be able to be doctors. It would not be until 1849 that Elizabeth Blackwell would become a doctor, the very first, graduating from Geneva College right here in New York. She was accepted on a fluke. She had submitted her papers to countless numbers of medical colleges. None of them took her seriously. So she finally went to some of the smaller ones, to some of the smaller rural colleges. And because the board of directors at Geneva could not make up their minds, they decided on a lark to hand over her submission to the students, 150 male students, to see what they would do. They thought it was all a joke and voted unanimously to accept her into the medical school, where she went and graduated head of her class. Initially, she was terrified at the sight of blood, but she persevered. She had taken over as main breadwinner for her family when they had moved here from England, and her father had passed away and they were living in Cincinnati, Ohio. And her younger sister would attend medical school as well. And while she was ready to be a doctor and prepared, America was not ready for a female physician. She would take her practice to England and to France and set up female hospitals, later come back over here and have a great impact on the training of nurses during the Civil War. Set up a women's hospital and orphanarium in New York as well. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, the only woman to date who's ever won a Congressional Medal of Honor. She would receive her medical degree in 1855, but no one was ready to go see her. Women would sneak to her back door, sharing their complaints so that no one would see her going to her in public. She was into dress reform too. After the Civil War, she decided that dressing like a woman hampered her practice of medicine. She had been in the field during the war for years and had come up with her own bloomer outfit and then a man's suit. So when she would go out after the war and lecture to people, she would wear a full male tuxedo, including a top hat. She always wore her Congressional Medal of Honor. Had been given to her by Andrew Johnson. Again, I'm getting sidetracked, but I get so excited when I think about women being able to take care of themselves. And this was what I was on a mission to do. There was a lecturer who came through. His name was Sylvester Graham. He was a learned man, and I was hypnotized the night that I heard him speak. He talked about self-care. It was rather strict, but simple and healthy, and it all made sense to me that if you followed a simple diet and avoided exciting your systems, your brain system, your blood systems, your lung systems, with things like caffeine, alcohol, meat, if you exercised and took care of your body, and if you drank plenty of water, that you could avoid almost any kind of disease. I was sharing this with one of the visitors to the library today, a physician. And when I said this, he said, this coincides very much with a lot of practices that we use today in medical practice, a simple diet. He believed in vegetarianism, which after hearing 2 or 3 of his talks, I decided not to eat meat anymore, or alcohol, or coffee, or stimulants, no tobacco. And I wrote about it. But writing about it wasn't reaching enough people. All right, I've been avoiding talking about something I can't put off any longer. When I was 15, 16, I got a letter from one of my uncles. By this time, I had found that I had enough of a desire to have a spiritual practice that meant something to me, to be approved of by a loving God. And I had discovered Quakerism. I had visited a Quaker family and I saw the ways that the husband and wife had an equal partnership, and how he had no domination over her. This was so new and unusual to me, and I loved that idea. But there were only one or two Quakers in town. One night, a young man came and knocked on my door, and he had a sled outside. It was wintertime. It was filled with furs, and he said, "Can I take you to my father and his friends? They would like to meet the only other Quaker in town." And so I went with him and talked with them, and they invited me to a Society of Friends meeting. I wasn't too impressed with what I saw. It was a lot of chanting and people just sitting and being quiet, but there was something there that appealed to me. And at age 15, I had declared myself a Quaker. A father accepted it. He said, "That's fine. I think of all the different religions I looked at, that probably the Quakers are the best of the bunch. And besides, in a few years, you'll get smart enough to quit." Mother remained silent on the subject. But I was longing for others who believed the same. So when a letter from my uncle came to me, telling me about a young man where he was living in Weir, who wanted to meet me, I decided to go. He was a very good-looking young man, and his name was Hiram Grove. And he began asking me to keep company with him. He was very kind, was very good to me. And I was under a lot of pressure from my parents and from my half-sister and other people to say yes to his proposals of marriage. All young women were expected to get married at that time. Many of my friends already were. And he was a Quaker, and he had access to a lot of other Quakers who lived in his town. And so I said yes. And that very night, I went back home, and I regretted having said yes. I thought, I don't really love this man. I really need to tell him that I'm going to call this marriage off. And it took me a while to do that, but I told him that it would not be an equitable relationship. I didn't feel for him the way he felt about me. And he wept and fell to his knees, and then said that this would be a great scandal in the eyes of my parents and his parents if I said no. I won't go into all the details, but I felt pressured again and decided that it would be easier to say yes, and that perhaps some good would come of this relationship. No good came of this relationship, except one thing. Our daughter, Elma, who was born the next year. She was a beautiful little girl. And for as much time as Hiram would spend away from home and I would have alone with our daughter, those were the happiest moments that I had in my life. What I had seen in other Quaker marriages, men and women working equally as partners, was not the case in our relationship. He dominated every aspect of my life. Outside the home, told me when I could and couldn't go out. He wasn't much of a worker. He was a hatter, but he really didn't work at it much, and so it was necessary for me to pick up needlework and mending, which I would do at night after Elma was in bed. I did that for years, to the point where my back was hunched over and my whole system was weakened. And whatever money I earned from doing that, he would take. And he dominated our life in the bedroom as well. I don't want to scandalize anyone here with the details, but it was the worst time of my life. And I came to the realization that marriage did have much in common with slavery. I decided to keep pursuing my writing, and more of my articles on women's health were being published. And I was reading about a woman by the name of Margaret Fuller, who was a great, wise woman and was going around the country giving lectures, something that was unusual for women to do at the time. And I was starting to hear about some of the other women, Lucretia Mott, who would give talks in public. And this Quaker minister said, if that is the passion in your heart, Mary, then that is what you need to do. And I could get paid. So now I was taking in the sewing in the evening, writing articles when I could, and I began to go out and give some lectures based on some of the pamphlets that I had written. And then I would take the additional lectures that I gave and put them into bigger forms, books, and those were being published. And everywhere I went and gave a talk, people were learning something. Women weren't talking to other women about their health. What mothers were telling their daughters was just as valid as whatever the doctors were telling. In some cases more. I have to say that most women who were dealing with other women as midwives, as parents, as sisters, who understood a female body system, the women knew just as much, if not more, than some of the doctors did. So I was so determined to get out there and promote women learning more. And the women responded. It was transformative. When these women would come and understand more about their own selves and their own autonomy, it gave them a freedom. It empowered them to have some peace and some control in their life, to take away a pain, to take away an ailment, to be able to help a child who was sick with the things I was teaching them. The idea of a simple diet, the idea of good sleep and fresh air, the idea of drinking lots of fresh water. It was helping a lot of people. The evenings that I had with Hiram, as painful as they were convincing me more and more that this was a situation I needed to leave. One of the worst examples was that when our daughter Alma was only 3 months old, he beat her. I didn't blame Hiram for this. I began to understand him as a man who was ill, as a man who had no contact with his own soul. I had no more hate for him than I would have for a machine that I could clearly see was designed to compress all the air out of my chest. I thought, this is not his fault. There's something wrong with him. He had had a horrible childhood. But as much sympathy and understanding as I may have had for the man, it didn't make me love him anymore. It didn't make the situation livable anymore. And after talking to another Quaker minister and a great friend of mine by the name of John Neal, no relation, I was encouraged that it would be all right for my benefit and for my daughter's benefit to leave him. Now, women in New York had only recently been given any kind of divorce rights. When a woman made so bold as to leave her husband, she left with the clothes on her back. If she had brought money into the relationship, that all stayed with the husband. Property stayed with the husband. Children stayed with the husband. So when I left with Alma, I didn't tell him I was going. And I went to live with my parents, who had also moved to Weir by that time. I had kept all this hidden from my parents for so long, but now they found out. And my father was furious. I told him he was an outspoken man. He was going to make sure that we were well taken care of. So when Hiram would come around and want to see me, my father refused to let him do so. The months went by. I was starting to feel a sense of freedom. I wanted to have a peaceful separation from Hiram. I wanted my daughter to have a relationship with him. But when he would come to visit, he was very guarded. My father kept a watchful eye. And over time, we got more and more relaxed with the situation. I had been asked to go to Boston and give one of my lectures. And it was while I was gone that there was an article in the newspaper about my absence. And Hiram saw that as his chance. He came during the night and he took Alma. I tried to go there, but by this time, my giving lectures and speaking about the female anatomy, about women's sexual rights, about the details of what makes up a woman and makes her different from man, had come to the attention and to the repudiation of the Society of Friends, who demanded that I stop lecturing or else declare myself no longer a Quaker. All of my lectures, all of my pamphlets, everything I had written was put in front of those judges who had to have both a small and a large meeting to decide if I was still qualified to be a Quaker. They all refused to read any of this scandalous material, but they all also decided that I could no longer be a Quaker, and I was asked to submit to them a piece of paper saying I no longer considered myself a Quaker. I had felt turned down by the Methodist Church when I was expelled from that school when I was 12 years old for being too outspoken. I had felt left down by the Presbyterians, and now I felt left down by the Quakers. But I would find out that there were some good Quakers. It was around this time that the Quaker movement was moving away from the more orthodox thinking to a more liberal view. And when I finally was able to get Alma back on a day when my lawyer and two other men went to her house, she wasn't even living with her father. He took her away and then put her with some neighbors. He wasn't really interested in taking care of her. He was interested in hurting me. So these two men went there on an afternoon. Fortunately, she was out working in the strawberry patch in the back. They were able to get her in a carriage and get her away. And of course, he was furious. But he and I weren't divorced yet. He and I were still married. And according to this Mr. Blackwell that I told you about earlier, who talked about the man and woman becoming as one, if the man and woman were one, the man couldn't very well sue his wife, or he'd be suing himself, and that was illegal. So he couldn't sue me. So he decided to sue the man who had taken Alma. And I felt it was my responsibility to be paying for this young man for his court expenses. That would go on for 2 years. So while I was trying to support Alma, trying to help my parents with some money, and also trying to support myself and further my career, I was also paying for this young man. It was a very stressful time. Eventually, he would be found innocent, and Hiram would finally agree to a divorce. The divorce was almost as painful as the marriage. But now I was free. And I found myself in New York. And by this time, I felt confident enough in what I knew that I set up my own school. It was a Graham school based on the teachings of Sylvester Graham. And it was for young girls to come to learn about themselves, to learn their regular subjects. They paid a little extra. I could teach them French as well. And it was a boarding school. It was in New York, and it was doing very well. And I had a friend there. Her name was Frances. She and I became great friends. She too had a daughter who was about the same age as Alma. She was about 6 or 7 at the time. And we would get together and we would share our stories. This was one of the other things that was happening in the country at that time as we got into the 1830s and 40s and 50s. As villages and towns were getting closer and closer together, women didn't have to walk 2 or 3 days to get to their neighbor's house, or even 2 or 3 miles. Women could lean over their back fences and talk to each other and exchange not just hellos and huckleberry pie, but also their hurts and their hopes, their trials and tribulations. This was what helped greatly with the women's rights movement, that women could actually get together and talk about their complaints and get some big ideas. And some of those ideas were starting to be realized. The state of New York would be the first to give women divorce rights. Women's teachers, female teachers, would get their rights as well. That was a long fight. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was so frustrated trying to talk to women. Don't you want to be making as much money as a man? As most of them were making a quarter, maybe a third of what the male teachers were making. And when the women voted it down, I think it was in the Dakota area, when the women teachers voted it down, she said, well, good. The sooner that these women starve because they have no money and die, we'll be better off without them so that we can get this passed. She had a wicked sense of humor, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She would, over the years, have things to say about my belief, too. It was at this time that I had come to believe that marriage, a formalized marriage, and the government having rules over a marriage was not a healthy situation. That an individual, man or woman, had the choice to be and live with someone they loved, genuinely loved. And if they genuinely loved them and had the right to leave when that love was over, we wouldn't need divorce laws. If someone is attracted to someone they genuinely love and care about, they will settle their differences in a loving way. I had been so traumatized by my time with Hiram. This was becoming more and more a priority for me. And the whole notion and talk about marriage laws and marriage rights was very near and dear to my heart. So when a young man by the name of Henry talked to me about the idea of free love, and then also introduced me to a new medical practice called hydrotherapy, I was quite attracted to him. And we would spend many, many hours together. This whole idea of free love was being talked about coast to coast. A man that I had met by the name of Stephen Pearl Andrews become very active in the free love movement. In fact, he was the one who would be responsible in 1872 for getting the name Victoria Woodhull on the presidential ballot, helping her to become the very first woman to ever officially run for president of the United States. And Victoria Woodhull was a huge proponent of free love. Now again, I see a few eyes rolling. So let me tell you what the meaning of free love was. I'm sure some of you already know this. It has gotten a very bad reputation and misrepresentation. We weren't trying to propose that a man or woman be in multiple relationships at one time. It was a monogamous relationship, a monogamous based on genuine love, choice, and contract. And the government had no right to dominate that. Love was the sphere of God, not the state. And while we may be subjected to the state's laws, we had to answer first to God's laws. And that was our belief. We also felt very strongly that if a man and a woman were in fact going to have children, that took the relationship to another level, and there needed to be an agreement of some permanence there for the sake of children. I saw the effect that living with Hiram and leaving him had on my own daughter. By the way, by this time, she had gotten very interested. We were living in a boarding house, and one of the men who was living there was a painter, a miniaturist painter. And she got fascinated with the idea of paints. And even though I was trying very hard to pay off our debts and to just make ends meet, I sold an article that I got $100 for, which had been unheard of, and was able to not only pay off the debts, but buy her a little paint set. And I'm happy to say that she grew up to be quite the accomplished artist herself. But this friend of mine, Frances, I'm getting a little distracted, I'm sorry. It was all those books, I'm telling you. Maybe Catherine Beecher was right. She said, women really shouldn't study or read books. It excites their brain, overexerts them, and they should just raise children and stay home. Catherine Beecher, by the way, never married, never had any children of her own, but was trying to teach all the mothers in this country how to raise their families. I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak ill. But Frances invited me to her house. It was New Year's Eve. The practice on New Year's Eve, women didn't go to the parties. They stayed home with each other. And if they were lucky, they would have some male visitors who would go from house to house. The men would go to the parties and then call on certain women. One of the men who came to the house was a man by the name of John Nichols. And I wasn't too impressed with him at first either, I have to say. But he was well-spoken, and he believed in women's rights, and he believed in health. He was a vegetarian. We had so much in common that we at least became friends right away. But over time, it became clear that he and I had a great affection for one another. I had never had any affection from my parents nor approval. I think it was why for so long I was looking for approval in my spiritual life from a loving God. But here was this man who embodied love in a way that I could understand. And he and I decided to get married. We had a Swedenborgian minister at our wedding, and I told him, I will not take any vow to honor and obey you. Mary Edwards Walker had done the same thing with her husband, refused to change her name, refused to wear a dress, she wore her bloomers. I was a little more traditional than that. But I said, I will only obey the true doctrines of love in my heart. And if I ever feel that I need to leave, if this is an unsafe or unhealthy relationship, that is what I must follow and take my daughter. And he said, I never expected anything less. We would start our own school in New York. He was a great believer and practitioner of this new method I had mentioned earlier of hydrotherapy, of cleansing the body from the inside and out with pure water. Now, hydrotherapy is very complicated, but there were several forms. You could do a full immersion. There were some places where the source of water would be up high, picture a waterfall, and you would be drenched in water, sometimes cold, sometimes hot. It also involved the recommendation that people drink 8 to 10 glasses of water a day, sometimes cold, sometimes hot, whatever the symptoms called for. There was the wet sheet practice, where if a person had hurt themselves, they would wrap themselves in a wet sheet, then many blankets around it, tape or pins to keep it closed. So at first they would be shivering, and then the whole physical system would be agitated and sweating would occur as they would get warm. And that this cleansed all the impurities out of the body. And there was much success with this. And my husband wanted to know more about it. So he enrolled at NYU. I helped pay for his tuition. But he said he went there mostly to study what the traditional doctors were learning so that he could find out what was wrong with what they were practicing. In the meantime, I would take some courses in hydrotherapy. It had been discovered by a Silesian Austrian by the name of Priesnitz. When he was a teenager, he was working in the field and had fallen under a wagon, a horse-drawn wagon, and had a bruised arm and several broken ribs, and his doctor told him that he would probably never be able to work again. This young man knew he was trying to help support his parents, and he wanted to support himself his whole life, so that wasn't good enough for him. So he took some wet cloths, he wrapped his ribs with the cloths, he pushed himself up against a chair and expanded his chest as much as he could to put the ribs back in place. And after a couple of weeks, those ribs had healed. And he began to study this whole idea of wetness and cold and heat being able to heal. I would study it, my husband would study it, and we would start our own school in New York. We would receive some criticism, but we also received a lot of praise. We would have meetings in our home, our parlor as it was. Some very famous people would come to those, as I mentioned, Herman Melville and Edgar Allan Poe. My friend Frances was also a good friend of Edgar Allan Poe's. In fact, she was a writer as well. And she visited his home many times when his wife, Virginia, was dying. And many people later would use those articles to get the best picture they could of Edgar Allan Poe during those tragic times when his wife was dying, when she visited him at his home. By the time Virginia died, Frances had kind of disassociated herself with Poe because, as you may know, there were many young women in Edgar Allan Poe's life who, in spite of his being married, tried to seduce him. And one of those young women who wanted him for herself started some very nasty rumors about my friend Frances. So she had kind of stepped away from that friendship. But those were exciting times. And our school was doing so well, we decided we wanted a more rural setting. We were inviting people to come, not just who wanted to learn how to practice hydrotherapy, but who needed hydrotherapy. And also people who were interested in starting what we called a new society. People who wanted to live in harmony with one another. Both John and I had seen so many systems fail. The churches that we had attended where people were there was so much animosity between the people. We had seen politics fail in the states, in our country. Disagreements and disharmony. And we were reading about the Oneida Society and how people were coming together to live in harmony and peace with each other. And the fewer laws you had, the more you could depend on the goodness of people to follow their own instincts, to express who they really are, to do what you could do well and be honored for it. This idea was very attractive to us. And I think it was at that time we were starting to move towards creating one of our own. And so we moved to a more rural area with our school, where we would also come under some criticism, run into some financial problems. Oh, and we also had our own daughter, Wilhelmina Mary, called her Willie for short. They were challenging times, but the bliss of that relationship compared to the experience I had with Hiram, I was so grateful for. It was wonderful. We had so many wonderful friends. But there were some big voices in this country. Horace Mann was one of them. And these people had access to the press. Horace Greeley would be a great supporter of ours. He had access to the New York Tribune. There was always debates going on. Part of the reason was because in the 1850s, the whole understanding of medicine was very, very, very broad and very, very, very shallow. There was so much yet to be learned. And there was a lot of quackery. And one kind of practice would be accusing another. The eclectic medical practitioners would be accusing the homeopaths. And of course, hydrotherapy was both praised and condemned. But we just followed what we felt was right for us. But eventually we would have to leave. And we had heard about a place called Modern Times, which is what got us to come here with our daughter. We had been friends with Stephen Pearl Andrews, whose name you probably know if you've been living in Brentwood for very long, and Josiah Warren. And so we came here. We thought, this is it. This is where we can have our school. This is where we can practice medicine. This is where we can help women. I was becoming very interested after I had my daughter in helping other women deal with their pregnancies and births. I saw some of the malpractice. But we would only be here for 2 years. I guess by this time, John had become a little too outspoken. And when he would write his pamphlets about what his expectations were for Modern Times, he used words like should and ought. And this did not go well with the people who were here already, who didn't want anyone telling them what to do or how to do it. We were just trying to follow the advice of Horace Mann, who had said at one time, do what no one else has done. Go where no one else has gone. Those people who are at the forefront of a new movement, I guess, always take the risk of putting themselves out there a little too far. There would be a lot of back and forth between the members here who appreciated what we were doing and those who misunderstood us. But it was too hard to watch our daughter, who is now 14 or so, going through all of this. My first daughter, Elma, the youngest one, was about 3 or 4. And so we decided to leave. We'd been reading about another community that was in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we went there. We set up another community there, Memnonia, named after a mystic statue erected on the Nile that was said to produce its own music for those people who came down the river. And John wrote many pamphlets about how this society was going to work. There was talk in the 1850s about this whole country going to war. And we felt more than ever the urgency of setting up a community that could live in peace with one another. But again, we would meet with people who disagreed with the way we thought. We would move to Yellow Springs, which already had its own springs. We thought this would be perfect for our hydrotherapy practice. And when I tell you in general terms that there were people who were criticizing the work we did, I'm not telling you about the letters and the visits that I got on a daily basis from people, not just around the country, but people from Europe who would travel here to find healing with us. There were many, many cures. But again, in Yellow Springs, it was Horace Mann, who was president of the Antioch College, which was rather new, who knew he had to raise a lot of money to finish off paying off that school. And he felt that this group of free thinkers in his area who were trying to set up a free community and throwing around the term free love would discourage people not only from that area, but from going to that college. And he did everything within his power to make up stories about my husband, about me, to try and get other people to say things about it. There was a young man, I think his name was Jared Gage, who was going to the college at that time. And there was going to be a meeting about whether we were going to be allowed to have this land there or not. And Horace Mann, of course, did not want us to have that land. He wanted the original owner to take it back from us. And they were walking across campus one night, and Jared, who had read many of my husband's publications, was walking with Horace Mann, and he said, is this meeting tonight open to the public? And he said, no, this is private. And he said, do you know of the Nichols? And the young man said, oh yes, I read many of his pamphlets. I think he's a fine man. In fact, I have visited their house, and I think that they're good people. He had actually come to my husband for some treatments and owned several of his books. He said, I think he's a wonderful man. And Horace Mann could only reply, well, then this meeting tonight is either going to determine a change of opinion about Mr. Nichols or change my opinion about you. It didn't change his opinion about my husband. They were still pushing to get us off that land. So Jared decided to take matters into his own hand. And he put notices all over the campus saying that he owned many of Mr. Nichols' books and would be happy to share them or sell them. This would bring him, of course, to the president's office, where we would ultimately be expelled. Not because he was trying to sell the books, but because he had decided at that point that he had so much sympathy for what we were trying to do, he came to live with us. And on those grounds, he was expelled. Those people made us feel validated, but I also felt badly that he had been kicked out of school. He found another way to get his education. We would have to leave that area too, but it was around that time that my husband and I were so dissatisfied with what was going wrong with these beautiful communities that we were trying to be part of. Why couldn't people find their peace? And the more and more we looked at other religions, and the more we looked at other communities, we saw within the Catholic Church a set of requirements and a set of recommendations that had been working for centuries. I know it seems to go against every instinct that we would be attracted to this formalized religion, but we were. I had been practicing spiritualism at that time. Again, 1848, that magic year, that was when the Fox sisters had started their spiritual readings. And everyone in the country, presidents, great leaders, everyone was drawn to this practice of spiritualism as much as they were to regular medicine. Because thanks to the Second Great Awakening, if you could have your own relationship with God, surely you could have a relationship with someone who had passed on. And now women had a voice. If women weren't allowed to speak publicly as themselves, if they were channeling Thomas Jefferson or Socrates, certainly you would have to listen to them. So women, this was a very popular idea for women. And one night I had a vision at a seance that we were at. And it was from a man who was dressed in Jesuit robes. And he encouraged me to find out more about the Society of Jesus. I ignored it. I couldn't understand why that message would come to me. And 3 months later, I had another visit from another man. He said his name was Gonzalez, also dressed in Jesuit robes, reproaching me for not having followed the advice of the first visitor. I would get a third visit, and I shared that with my husband. And we would seek out more information about the Catholic Church. And ultimately, my husband and myself and my daughter would all be baptized in the Catholic faith. This was a loving God I could relate to. And maybe we did need some laws and regulations if they were based on love. Expectations to be the good people that God expected us to be. All the people in our movement would come to us and say, what could you possibly be thinking? Now we were even separated from our dearest friends by having made this choice. They said, the Catholic Church has suppressed women for years. And I said, no, look at the Blessed Virgin. Do you think that St. Clare is any less than her compatriot, St. Francis? St. Catherine was a doctor of the church. St. Teresa, all these women were accomplished, educated women, and the church holds them up, saying that women have a voice. Women have something to contribute to society. We would start practicing our Catholic faith and incorporate it with some of the medicinal practices that we were trying to propose to the country. And we were getting wonderful feedback. I remember doing a water healing with the Mother Superior at the convent where we were staying down there in Yellow Springs in Brown County. And she wrote wonderful letters about us and sent it out to many of her friends. We were contacted by the city of Cleveland in Ohio to come there and to work with some of the priests and nuns there. And we felt really drawn now to sharing our services at reduced prices with clergy, with the nuns, with the children in the orphanages, and with women. The seminary there in Cleveland, St. Mary's Seminary, would hire us to come there and treat some of their priests. The bishop, Adam Rapp, would recommend us to other parishes in Mississippi, in New Orleans, in Chicago, in Indiana, in Pennsylvania. And for the next several years, we were traveling around, doing our healing within the church and without. We wouldn't turn people away. But it was 1861, and this country was getting ready to go to war. And my husband could not stand the idea of a divided union. He never believed that the threats of secession would ever come to fruition. He believed so strongly that people could get along with each other, that when those shots were fired at Fort Sumter, when we saw the ships going out, we were back in New York at the time, and we saw the ships going out from the harbor, I think to relieve the troops at Fort Sumter. They were taking munitions there. It broke his heart. And he decided that he didn't want to live in a country that could not be united. And so that was when we made our decision to move to London. We would pick up our practice there. I would continue to write there. He would immediately form his own company, open his own health store called the Health Depot right there in London. We would have another one in Malvern when we lived there. He had his own newspaper. Over the years, we would have many of our own publications because as much as the press wanted to say negative things about it, the only way to combat that is to have your own newspaper. That's what Victoria Woodhull did when she declared her own candidacy for presidency. The newspapers were just talking about what she was wearing. It didn't matter that she had already set herself up as the very first female stockbroker on Wall Street. Everybody was questioning her sanity, you know. So she decided to start her own newspaper. And that really helped her get a little bit of leverage in that political race. Grant would have eventually be reelected. Even Susan B. Anthony didn't vote for Victoria Woodhull because the free love movement was interfering with progress for the women's rights movement. It was too scandalous. But we had some good years in London and in Malvern. We had some sadness too. Our young daughter, John's and my daughter, would get very sick and she would pass away. And John would write about it ceaselessly. He said, I know the main question is how can this couple who has studied health and all its proponents for so long, how do they explain that their own daughter died? He felt he needed to justify that and he couldn't. He couldn't. So many of the methods he believed in hadn't worked for our daughter. I wasn't able to talk about it for months. But our other daughter, Alma, from my first marriage, overcoming the sins of the father, perhaps, she would marry, have two beautiful children. And so some of the time that I spent writing, I would write children's stories for those two little grandchildren of mine, a little boy and a little girl. I loved them. I suppose in looking back at my life, I can see both the earnest good efforts that I made and some accomplishments, as well as some missteps that I may have made. Some people didn't understand my love for spiritualism, certainly not my conversion to Catholicism. But I suppose it comes down to following your heart, just writing your own story. Now more than ever, I'm doing a lot of healing work, but I really want to get back to writing that book about helping women with their pregnancies and having a painless childbirth. That's one of my biggest goals right now. I think I could help a lot of women with that. But I would leave you with this one thought, and that's simply just to thank you for letting me tell my story. It's important for us to tell our stories to each other. You know, I wish I had time to listen to all your stories, but I would encourage you to share your stories with each other. When you have time, read other people's stories, read a little history and share a little history with each other. And always remember that it's never too late to make a little history of your own. Thank you. Mary Nichols would pass away at the age of 74 in 1884. She was still living in England at the time. She never did get around to writing that last book she so desperately wanted to write to help other women. But if you were to look at some of the passages from it, from some of her notes, many of the practices she talks about are still used today, mainly cold compresses. Sit-spats, getting mothers up on their feet as soon as possible. Many of her writings and her husband's writing were extremely explicit and extremely provocative for their time, but they were also incredibly accurate in many cases. And she did a lot of good to advance not just the study of women's health, but promoting female physicians in this country. My name is Ann McAvoy. I'm from Women in History in Cleveland, Ohio. I know you've visited with Ruth, some of you before, virtually. It's always an honor to get out and tell some of these women's stories. We tell over 60 women's stories who had some impact on women's history. I do not pretend to know half of what you know about modern times and Brentwood, but this was also an excuse for me to come and visit an aunt I have here in Sayville. So I gladly accepted the invitation. I'm happy to try to answer any questions you have or guide you toward material where you could find it if you have any today. Does anybody have any questions at all?
I do.
Yes.
You said that pregnant women had to wear those corsets.
Mm-hmm.
How did they?
They, you know, they had the binding that you could adjust, but they still felt that it was immodest to go out without clothing, or you didn't go out of your house. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had 7 children, Susan B. Anthony kept being like, would you stop having children? I need you to write more speeches for me, you know. So Elizabeth would write the speeches and Susan would take them out on the road until she finished having children and they'd go together. But you did not talk about being pregnant. It's one of the reasons that most towns, you couldn't be a married school teacher, because if you got pregnant, you couldn't expose the children to a pregnant woman. Laura Ingalls Wilder is one of the characters that I do. And they said in most instances, traveling across the prairie, children would wake up one morning and they'd have a new brother or sister that their mothers had kept a secret the whole time that they were pregnant, because you didn't talk, because you'd have to admit that you'd had sex, I suppose, with your spouse. Where was I going with any of that? Oh, the corsets, okay. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she would have none of that. She was very liberal in the way she raised her children. She opened windows, fresh air, no binding of the kids or anything that everybody was doing. But you didn't even talk about after the baby was born. It was, you know, you had to wait till the baby was 4 or 5 months old, again, to make sure the baby lived, you know. But when she had a boy or she had a girl, she would raise a flag above her house pink or blue, so that everybody in the neighborhood knew what she had had. Yeah. So thank God for those outspoken women who took us a little farther. Yeah, there were so many practices that were so unhealthy for women, you know, just really. Anyway, anybody here in the medical field? That's okay. No, I'm not judging. I'm just curious. So thank you so much for your time and attention and the invitation to be here. I appreciate it. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So she went to school kind of on and off after their first move. She attended school. It was a Methodist school. And because she was so outspoken, she was expelled from the school. Later, when she wanted to become a teacher at like 15 or 16, it was one of the first ways that she started earning money. She had to pass a test, and part of the test, part of the qualification was getting a letter of recommendation from the husband of the female teacher who had kicked her out of school at the Methodist school, but he gave it to her. And you also had to make your own quill pen. You had to make your own quill pen and show that you could write your own name. So, yeah.
And just as a point of information, modern times in 1850, women were allowed to vote in modern times before they had the right to vote in New York. It was part of the Equitable Society of Free Love, again, that had the bad reputation, but was not particularly accurate in that sense. But women always have an equal voice in everything.
That makes perfect sense, yeah. I purposely did not go into a lot of detail about modern times because I was like, that's these people's sphere. I'll stick to what I know. So, but thank you. That's interesting. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. Oh, thank you. And the